So I want to preface today by saying that this is a sermon that talks about race and racism and some of the painful realities around that. And that can bring up a lot of feelings for people. So I will be available after the service here in the sanctuary if anyone finds that they need to talk or even just sit for a bit. So Black liberation theologian James Cone, who passed yesterday, said in one of his last interviews that he had turned to reading James Baldwin in his later years as the holy trinity of his intellectual influences. He said was Martin, Malcolm, and Jimmy. And James Baldwin, of course, like James Cone, was a fearless critic of the racism which he saw as absolutely endemic to American society. And if he did not agree with Malcolm X's vision of separatism, neither did he share Dr. King's optimism. James Baldwin famously said that to be black in America and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. Like Dr. King, who viewed the white moderate almost as big of an obstacle to his work as the Klan, for Baldwin, it was the indifference to black suffering that he saw in white people that disturbed him the most, even more than overt acts of hatred. He said, "I'm terrified at the moral apathy, the death of the heart in this country." A country for which he also claimed great love and great affection. He challenged white America to look beyond that apathy, to look unflinchingly at what America is, to understand what it must become. Not everything that is faced can be changed, he said, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. There's been a lot in the news to be faced in recent weeks regarding the way race and racism functions in America. Many of you may be aware of the story of the two black men who were arrested in a Philadelphia Starbucks on April 12th. This is Brianna Edwards reporting on the story from theroot.com. She says, Rashawn Nelson told the Associated Press that he originally thought nothing of it when the Starbucks manager told him he was not allowed to use the restroom because he wasn't a paying customer. He also shrugged it off when he and his business partner, Dante Robinson, were approached and asked if they needed help. They informed staff that they were just waiting to have a business meeting. "We were there for a real reason, a real deal that we were working on," Robinson added. "We put in a lot of time, energy, effort. We were at a moment that could have a positive impact on a whole ladder of people, lives, families." Mere minutes after they had taken their seat, they saw the police walking toward them. "That's when we knew she called the police on us," Nelson said. Brianna Edwards reports that Robertson and Nelson arrived at the store at around 4:35 for a 4:45 p.m. meeting with local businessman Andrew Yaff. Call logs showed that the Starbucks employee called 911 at 4:37 p.m., 2 minutes after they entered the store. Andrew Yaff arrived at the Starbucks front door as Robinson and Nelson were being walked out in handcuffs, and the two spent hours in jail, only being released after midnight because the police refused to charge them for trespassing. And the Starbucks incident only came to national prominence because a woman at the scene videotaped the incident, and she posted it on social media where it went viral. And as is often the case, the incident served as a lightning rod for conversation, not because it is so unusual, but because it speaks to the experience that is all too common for people of color. The experience of being perceived as a threat for the mere fact of existing. The experience of being challenged, questioned, surveilled, or even policed for being black or brown in white spaces. And as is often the case, other incidents surfaced. A golf course in Pennsylvania called the police on 5 black women who they say were golfing too slowly. The women say they were golfing like regular golfing. Called the police. In a terribly harrowing story, a 14-year-old African-American teenager in Michigan was shot at by a local homeowner, a white homeowner, after he missed the school bus and he knocked on the door asking for directions. Fortunately, he was not hurt and the shooter was arrested. Here in Indiana, RTV6 reports on a string of racist and homophobic messages that have been left all the property of DePauw University starting on April 12th and continuing over the space of a week, which is a different way of announcing who does and who doesn't belong in a given space. And the FBI is investigating those incidents. In a conversation on Slate.com, a sociology professor, Tressie McMillan Cottom, talks about the ubiquity of this experience for people of color, of having their right to be in a space challenged by white people. So a few months ago, she says, I tried to go to a yoga class. I pull up and park in the lot attached to the building. I'm early, so I sit and eat my snack and read a book for a while. First, a white woman did that aggressive hello thing at me through the window. 5 minutes later, the front desk employee came outside to tell me they don't allow trespassing. I was a paying customer. I'd paid online. She continues, I also want to shout out the more muted version of this. It's the extra question that to be asked has to assume that you are somehow in the wrong place. Are you looking for X when you're perfectly fine, for example, just standing there? This is the insert obvious description of the place you're standing, they say to you, which is a way for frontline staffers and just regular white people to initiate an exchange where you're supposed to explain why you're there. It's that we are always somehow in the wrong place, she says. It looks like service, but it is social control. So this question of who is public space for is at the heart of how racism functions. At the highest and most fundamental level, it's a question of who is this country for? And the answer to that question is often most cruelly written onto the black and brown bodies that find themselves at ground zero of explicit policies and implicit biases, in arrest and incarceration and deportation. Last Saturday, I was at the Faith in Indiana Families First Convention, formerly known as IndyCan. UUI is a part of IndyCan, and many UUI people were there. And I watched a woman describe in tears her experience as an undocumented member of our community, and the threat of deportation that she lives under despite having lived in Indy since she was 5. Despite all the good she and her husband do in the community, they're church musicians for several churches, they're volunteers, they do social justice work. Despite the bureaucratic mix-ups that stymied her many attempts to get her documents in order, it's not that she didn't try. Despite her having small children who are American citizens and who will be faced with the terrible choice of losing either their parents or their country, she lives under the threat of deportation. Her husband was detained by ICE agents, is still detained. She was detained by ICE agents. They only let her go so she could tend to the medical emergency of her children. And she described the ICE agents who mocked her as they arrested her. Got another one, they said to her, laughing. And she has another hearing at which she may well be deported. And this is the dehumanization that drives the policies that separate families and tear holes in our community. Got another one. And to what end? In service of the notion of who belongs, of who this country is for. And as if to punctuate that point, the same day that I listened to that woman sob in public, there were 18-foot tall Nazi symbols burning at a right-wing rally on a field in Georgia the very same day, which I think is an image that I will never not be utterly shocked by, although I've actually seen it twice in just the last year. And of course, this question of who is our country for and who are our public spaces for, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's shaped by our history that for so long said this country and its public spaces are for white men, and then later for white people, and then reluctantly, slowly, partially for everyone else. If nothing can be changed until it is faced, then how are we facing up to that history? When apartheid ended, South Africa went through a national truth and reconciliation process in which they invited testimony of all of the evils of that system, and they put it all out there to see. They put it all out there for the sunlight to disinfect. First truth, and then reconciliation. Truth is prelude to reconciliation. And in America, we have not had anything like this process. In fact, we are deeply averse to talking in any serious way about our history, about the history of racism and its impact. When I grew up, I absorbed the liberal mythic view of American history about racism, which goes something like this. This is a country that was conceived in liberty. Unfortunately, there was this one exception called slavery, which was a very long time ago, and everyone agrees it was terrible, and it ended. Then there was Jim Crow racism, which was in the South, and we ended that in the 1960s. And now we're in a post-racial society where everyone celebrates Dr. King's vision, and we can expect the last bits of racism to slowly fade away. That is the story that I was raised on. And of course, this narrative feels warm and fuzzy, it's aspirational, but it's not grounded in reality. And in our modern discourse, it is even used to turn responsibility for overcoming white supremacy back on its victims. Slavery was such a long time ago, it is said. Why are you still playing the race card? And this is a question that I have heard many white people ask people of color non-rhetorically. And no one told me growing up that the state that I lived in until just before I was born in 1971, was a de facto segregated state. Indiana, that black people couldn't go to lunch counters, or beaches, or public parks, or movie theaters, or rent a hotel in Indiana until as late as 1968. And no one in my white community ever talked about that. It was not considered important for me to know that, to understand the place where I lived. The memory was already being erased by the 70s. Nothing can be changed until it is faced. The Southern Poverty Law Center recently released a report called Teaching Hard History that concluded that America's schools are doing an inadequate job of teaching the history of slavery, and particularly in connecting the legacy of slavery, followed by 100 years of racist hiring and housing policies, to the present reality of inequality. Today, the median wealth of black families is 9% of the median wealth of white families. And that is not an accident, that's policy. That is the result of policies that were consciously chosen to create that reality. That is centuries of organized theft in action, and it has lasting impact. A recent report concluded that there had been essentially no progress for black families on unemployment and home ownership in the last 50 years. And half of white millennials polled believe that racism against white people is now as big a problem as racism against any other kind of people. Half of millennials. This is not a problem that is going to fade away, because we are not a nation that has come to grips with its history and how that history informs our reality. And that is just talking about how white supremacy impacted African Americans, which is just one part of the story, and there's an entirely different story about our treatment of our neighbors on our southern border and how that impacts the stories with immigration today. Now, as Unitarian Universalists, our faith response to this legacy and this history is unambiguously to declare that everyone belongs. Everyone belongs, that each person has inherent worth and dignity, that the function of love is to draw the circle of connection and caring, to draw that circle of welcome wider and wider. Our faith response is that we need one another to be fully human, and that our fates are bound up together, and that I cannot be free until you are free. And what we are learning as a religious community is that we also have not done a good job of facing up to the legacies of racism within our own tradition. It is not enough to just have the ideals. They have to be put into practice and that requires intentionality. Because anti-racism is not just a state of mind, although it is a state of mind. And anti-racism is not just a loving heart, although it is a loving heart. Anti-racism is a practice. And at the heart of that practice for white people is being able to face up to our history in a non-defensive way and to listen to the experiences of people of color who have been telling us loud and clear that racism doesn't just exist somewhere out there, but it also lives here in our churches and in our history. And I want to honor the courage of those people of color who have been truth tellers in our movement, who have shared the moments when their experiences within Unitarian Universalism have been uncomfortable, have even been painful. That's a difficult thing to do, to name that truth. And it shouldn't be the work of people of color to do that, to name that truth for us. But many have felt compelled to because of their devotion to Unitarian Universalism, because of their desire to see us live up to our ideals with love, and also not without some anger and some frustration. They have been speaking their truth. And these conversations can be very challenging, and they can bring up a lot of tough feelings. And our faith tradition, which teaches compassion and acceptance, asks us in this moment to listen to each other's experiences with what has been called a holy curiosity, and to sit with those tough feelings rather than shut them down or deflect them or withdraw from conversation. We're called to love each other through these difficult moments, and then we can make something better, all of us together. So this year, UUI has been having conversations around a proposed eighth principle to Unitarian Universalism, a proposed eighth principle which makes explicit this commitment to being a truly welcoming community, to create spaces that are truly for everyone. And it makes it clear that part of that work will be facing up to our own prejudices, not just around race. And we all have prejudices because we're human. And part of that work will be facing up to past prejudices and past assumptions about who our spaces are for and how they have been shaped, how those assumptions have shaped our current reality. To give you an example that is not about race, there's a big conversation in Unitarian Universalism right now about how people with disabilities of one kind or another experience our religious communities. And it is an important conversation to be having. So as a result of this eighth principle work that we've been doing, the Board of Trustees is recommending that we strengthen the language around inclusion in our UUI bylaws to make it clear that we have an active commitment to creating a truly welcoming space. And we want that commitment to inform every part of the life of this church. And there's going to be an update about the larger eighth principle conversation at the May meeting and in the e-blast, so watch for that. But I want to close by saying one last thing, and it may be the most important thing. That's why it's at the end. Because it's about healing. How do we get from facing up to racism to healing from racism? How do we get from truth to reconciliation, to true reconciliation? The legacy of centuries of racism is a massive differential in power over who gets to shape our public policies, who gets to set priorities and direct resources, whose needs and comfort gets catered to. And racism and all of the other isms lives in that differential of power. Because racism is prejudice plus power. It's not just disliking you. Racism is not just disliking you. Racism is having the power to deny you a job, or deny you a bank loan, or have you walked out in handcuffs from a Starbucks because I feel afraid and the justice system caters to my fears. That's racism, and it lives in that differential of power that centuries have created. Gene Demby is an African-American writer for the NPR program Code Switch, and he shared something that he'd read that really struck me about the challenges that we're going to face in dealing with the legacy of racism and dealing with that differential. He quoted a Boston University theologian named Dan Hogue, who said, "I think one issue is we white people imagine that the end game of anti-racism is harmonious relationships rather than equal power to shape society." Say that again. We white people imagine that the end game of anti-racism is harmonious relationships rather than equal power to shape society. So white people, the people with the most power and resources, imagine the end game of anti-racism as collective niceness, rather than as black and brown people having the power to shape society, the equal power to shape society. And those are two very different mission statements. One of them is, can't we all just get along? Can't we be nice? Can't we feel the love together? And the other is, how do we shift power in society so that all people have equal power to shape our collective reality? And for white people in America as a group, that necessarily means asking, how do we surrender some of the power that was given to us by 400 years of racism? An equivalent statement could be made about men and women and patriarchy. How do we surrender the power that was given to us by centuries of sexism, or cisgender people and transgender people? Because if we really want this country to be for everyone, then there's going to have to be a transfer of power. And I would suggest that that reality and the anxiety around it is some of what is driving the current perversity in our politics and the eruptions of hatred that we're seeing in our public spaces. It is fear by some of losing power and control. But on the other side of that loss of control is a space that is big enough for everyone. It's a space where everyone gets to be free. Now, that's not an easy vision to live into, to willingly surrender power. Not on a national level, not on a local level, not within our own relationships. But as Unitarian Universalists, in fact, we teach our children to do this. We teach them a practice called take space and make space, which means that they watch when they're making decisions together to see whose voice is not being heard and who is not at the table. And they watch themselves so that if their own voice is dominating the conversation, they step back. And they create space for other voices to be heard. And they willingly give up their power in that moment to empower other people. That's what we teach our children here. And they get it. And they can do it, and so we can do it too. We can do difficult things in the name of love and justice. It is what Unitarian Universalists have done for generations, bravely, lovingly, imperfectly. It's what our ideals and our principles call us to do now. May our love give us the courage to make it so. Blessed be, and amen.